going to actually hit record now on the session for a couple people who wanted to participate but weren't able. Oh, and there we go. And Micheline, I think you guys are back. You are hopefully audible to us now, so nice to see you.
Hey, no, thank you so much for doing this. We're really happy to be here. It's a very interesting book. We're not nearly as smart as everyone on the call, but we're ready to learn.
Oh, we got you fooled. Fantastic. All right. So like I said, I'll just do a quick summary, and I'd just love it if you guys want to do a free-form chat after that. So essentially, this book is detailing one of the most important events in medical history, which is Jon Snow, not Game of Thrones, obviously, but the other more historical Jon Snow, figuring out that the cholera epidemic that was raging through London was due to a waterborne illness, which flew in the face of the prevailing theory of disease at the time, which was miasma theory. So miasma being something that smells bad. And so bad smells were thought to either trigger disease or be the causative agent of disease. And that was really what people thought was causing it. And they were backed up a little bit by kind of correlation. So places that smelled bad tended to be lower class, tended to have less supplied water, less air quality. So in fact, places that smell bad do in fact tend to have more disease happening, not as a causative agent, but just because that's going to tend to be associated with other things that we now know lead to the breeding of germs, lack of hygienic conditions, lack of sewage. And for those of you who were able to read some of the book, the descriptions of the sewage, I think I threw up in my mouth just a little bit when they were discussing exactly how poor the drainage was, especially when they got to the actual Broad Street well and described that the well had been contaminated by cholera because there was this massive, basically septic tank that was abutting it, and it had rotted through the bricks, and they could just pull the bricks out, and all the mortar was just completely soaked through with nasty material. Then that's how the disease actually spread into the well. So spoilers for anybody who's halfway through the book, it was the well. But so essentially this was one of the first things that really put a nail in the coffin of the miasma theory of disease, which had been around for millennia. And I think one of my favorite quote about miasma theory of disease is that a lot of times people would try to fight miasma spread of disease by fighting bad odors with good odors. So they would have, let me ask this. So when you guys think of a doctor now, what instrument or what little thing carried around do you associate with a doctor? So what does
a stethoscope?
A stethoscope, cool. That's pretty much the popular answer. Anybody got any others? I'm hoping that tricorder looking ultrasound devices will actually take the place of the stethoscope before long. But yeah, the stethoscope is pretty much the universal symbol for I'm a doctor. But in the 1700s, it was actually a cane with a little hollow ball at the top that had some holes in it. They'd sprinkle spices and flowers and other things in it, and they'd actually have it stuck up to their nose while they were examining patients. They were always inhaling pleasant odors to fight the miasmas, to fight the bad smells that they were exposed to. And also, anybody familiar with these guys? It's the plague doctor mask. Yeah, the plague masks were actually, the beaks were not designed to look like a bird just to look like a bird. They were designed so you had a nice little hollow pouch to put rose petals and flowers and other things like that to do the same thing, to fight the poor smells that people were exposed to. And one of my favorite little coincidences of medical history is that the plague doctors wore these masks. They wore heavy kind of waxed leather overcoats and boots and gloves. And they basically had the equivalent of a medieval hazmat suit to fight bad smells, which coincidentally happened to also not let them get infected by flea bites and things that would actually cause the plague. So it was a weird prefiguration of a good idea for the exact wrong reason. So is everybody familiar with the plague doctor suits, or does anybody want to take another look? $20 off Amazon. I highly recommend it. It was money well spent.
If you weren't delirious before, you'll be delirious after.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm actually going to wear it around campus once we're allowed to kind of migrate around on a full-time basis again. So one other little fun thing about miasma was that there were those who actually, let me throw this back at you guys. So who's heard of homeopathy? Okay, most people nodding. Somebody give me a quick summary on what homeopathy is. And I don't I don't care if you like it or dislike it. Just give me an idea about what the theory behind it is.
So essentially, it's like if you take the most tiny particle of an effective treatment and you use somehow give someone that it will somehow resonate with the larger treatment effect of that element. So the idea is if in your, I don't follow this at all, but if, for example, like your energy or whatever needed more zinc, you would get a tablet with like a minuscule of zinc, and then it would somehow resonate in your system and bring in all of the power of the like a true dose of zinc. So it's essentially tiny pathetic doses of things that might in theory be effective.
That was a way better explanation than I was expecting. I think I was just going for like cures like. So good job on that one. So the theory at the time was that basically if you had a fever, you would take a very minuscule amount of something that would otherwise cause a fever, and somehow that would kind of would cure the like thing. And I gotta say, it's not a terrible theory. It's not panned out or supported by evidence in any way, but as far as theories goes, it was something worth looking into. But some people had the same idea about miasma. And so there was actually this fad when there was an outbreak of plague in one city that they said, oh, instead of smelling nice things, we should fight the plague by smelling terrible things. And so people were actually hanging out in public latrines and like sticking their faces into the sewers and trying to inhale the most noxious, horrible smells they possibly could to fight the illness, which I think, yeah, the looks on your faces mirror my perception of exactly what that was probably like. Cool. So yeah, so essentially the miasma theory of disease was that bad smells were the causative agent, and that was complicated because bad smells are associated with unhygienic, poorly supplied areas with bad food storage. I mean, no refrigeration back in Victorian England, and all of those things really kind of clouded the ability of people to see beyond it. Plus, when something is medical dogma, it's really hard to displace it because you'll always find people trying to come up with ad hoc or post hoc ways to explain why we should accept contradictory evidence. So I think it's very hard to earnestly look at evidence to turn our backs on the standard way we think things are and actually let the data speak for itself. So that's one of the triumphs of modern science. And I think the epidemiology that was taking place in this is one of the best insights in terms of how science should actually work. So those of you actually got a chance to read it, what did you think of the, John Snow obviously was doing a lot of work, but the other, the Reverend who was going door to door, I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the book. Anybody want to take over while I take a sip of water? Going once? Going twice?
I'll jump in here since
Thank you.
I introduced myself. I'm a civil engineer. So the whole sewer network and all the studying that went on to, sort it all out, the mapping, everything was fascinating from that standpoint for me. Coincidentally, I'm also an Episcopalian, so the Anglican minister was another connection that I know it was like, yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Well, what did you think of that's something I hadn't really ever heard of before, was the just engineering marvel that was the London sewer system after this happened and how they had to deal with it. What were your thoughts on that?
I'm always amazed at what they're able to do with, I guess what I would think as rudimentary knowledge, but I mean, they did it, and, it would take us years to plan out something like that now, and they just put pencil to paper and start laying bricks, and it works. So, I think it's fascinating, and that he was without actually being able to see the cholera, in the water. He knew, he used his other reasoning abilities to sort it out. Is impressive.
Yeah, I really liked how they had the idea that he had that triggering insight when he was working with miners during a cholera outbreak, and kind of saw that their water and food and latrines were all able to cross-contaminate. And that was really kind of the way that he spotted that. So there's even kind of an occupational health angle on it. Oh, Amy, just to jump back, what would it be a civil engineer's dream to be able to design a city from the sewer system up rather than having to work with an existing city and retrofit everything?
Sorry, I got interrupted.
Oh, no worries. I'm actually waiting for my kids or my dogs to let out an earth-shrieking howl here in a minute, so we'll see when it happens. I was just curious if the prospect of designing a city from the sewer up would be a civil engineer's dream, since it seems like you probably always have to work with something that's already in place and can't be interrupted while you're trying to fix it up.
Yeah, definitely. Just the thoughts of being able to plan a city out from the beginning would be a dream, because now we're always working around too many variables and constrictions, and yeah, but to be able to plan a system that huge without all the other utilities being in the way or other buildings and roads to interfere would be good.
Yeah, I really liked the insight that they had about how this was kind of the dawn of modern science in a way, because science as a natural philosophy and science had been kind of coming together at that point and had really had real bump during the Enlightenment with Isaac Newton and others. But I really liked how the medical sciences at the time were almost non-existent, in that people were just writing letters to journals with their opinion, no data whatsoever, no real rigor to the experiments. And I really liked how this one, this series of events was that John Snow had a hypothesis and he kept on putting it forward. And the Reverend who was doing a lot of the work on Broad Street was a skeptic, but was actually brought around by the actual data. I thought that was just amazing, was that not only credit to him for being open-minded, but it really shows the best of what science should be able to do, which is let the data convince people of its rightness when you have enough control over the variables and you're able to actually see the patterns that develop. So I thought that was something I hadn't really appreciated about this process before, was it was really one of the crucibles for modern science to really shine. Let's see. All right, if I get desperate, I think all my students and ex-students, I'm going to pop quiz you on the microbiology, because I don't know enough about cholera to hazard a guess. Oh, and they just signed off. Okay. So I'm kind of curious. So who'd actually heard of cholera, the actual organism, kind of prior to this discussion? I think like everybody kind of froze on me. Oh, there we go. Okay. So had you guys heard of it, or is this kind of a new entity for some of you? Because I think being in modern medically advanced country, massive diarrheal diseases are thankfully something we don't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But once something's in the water supply, it seems like it would be a real bear to get out. And I think it's really kind of fascinating to see how people had to deal with that. And that I'm trying to remember exactly, but there was a part in the book where they described how it made the jump to human infection somewhere in the Indian subcontinent, and it really didn't show as a clinical entity until I think 16 or 1700s, but then it kind of got a worldwide spread thereafter. Let's see. So let me jump back a little bit. Did anybody else catch the little tidbits about Jon Snow's previous occupation in medicine? And again, I made a bad Game of Thrones joke earlier, but feel free to do it again. Oh, go for it. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
You're right.
I guess
Your feed's a little rough.
anesthesiologist is the best way I can put it.
Could you start again? Your feed kind of
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Essentially, he was for lack of better words, a self-taught anesthesiologist is what that is.
Oh yeah.
Big time. So I think that's what he was really. He experimented with all these types of. Well, he was one that came up with chloroform. So I guess that was what he really was, and this was sort of more of a side project for him, is the way I looked at it.
Yeah, actually, so quick correction. He wasn't the guy who came up with chloroform as an anesthetic. That was a guy named James Simpson.
Mhm.
Oh, and sorry, I just had a
Uh-huh.
monster groundhog just run past my window. Okay, no, anyhow, but so ether as an anesthetic, which Snow had investigated, had been discovered in America, in Boston. But James Simpson was a guy in England, or the UK at least, who first was looking for other anesthetics and came across chloroform. Actually, kind of a funny story, which will horrify anyone who knows anything about anesthesia, is that he would basically get friends together and they would sniff various potential anesthetics and see what happened. And when they got to chloroform, apparently they opened up the chloroform, everybody took a whiff, and then they described waking up on the floor and having to like kind of stumble to the windows and open the windows to air the room out because they'd all just completely passed out as the chloroform hit them. So they realized it was a pretty potentially strong anesthetic at that point. But I think that's one thing Snow really contributed that they brought in the book, is that he figured out how to titrate the ether and then titrate the chloroform in a way that people could actually take it and not, you could reliably dose it. Huh, my internet was really good for a while. Now it's really spotty. So there we go. So if I'm fading in and out, please let me know. Let's see. So with the chloroform, I think the key thing for that actually illustrates another thing in medical history, that when people in authority endorse something, it actually goes much better. And in his case, you can't go much higher than Queen Victoria, who had had one of her children delivered under chloroform, and once she endorsed it, everybody was hunky-dory. There's actually another funny little story about that, and I feel like I'm just monopolizing the conversation, so I'd really encourage anybody to speak up when you get a chance. But the quick funny story, sort of, on chloroform was they started using it in obstetric procedures to make labor easier before Queen Victoria took it. And there was actually a massive outcry, and there was actually I don't know the name, but there was a reverend in the Church of England who wrote that he was against use of it because it did, and I think the exact quote is, did rob God of the earnest cries of women in labor. So that was, it was felt that women were supposed to be suffering through the process of giving birth. But after the Queen of England used it, everybody seemed to get on board with it pretty quickly, and there wasn't a whole lot of complaint thereafter. Hey, kitty cat. Hey, Emily's kitty cat. And there may be a puppy jumping on my lap at some point during the session too. So if that happens, just be ready. So I'm curious if anybody's been under surgical. Who's been under surgical anesthesia in the crowd? Yeah, I don't think I would not have wanted my bones pinned back together without it. I'm a big fan.
It's up mute.
Oh, there we go.
Hey, I'm probably the only one on this call that's actually been under ether.
Oh, no kidding. Do tell.
Yes. For a tonsillectomy in about 1960.
Wow.
Yeah.
Evidently it went
when
okay, but let's.
When I woke up, I threw up really good.
Yeah.
But that felt really good on that freshly excised tonsillar bed.
It did. It was great. And somebody had to clean it up besides me, so I was okay.
Wow.
So in 1960, they were still using ether. That's impressive.
Yes.
Where
Well,
was that?
It was in Alabama.
So, it's kind of third world country then. So what do we know?
Who knows what was going on there?
So funny enough, one of the things I wanted to discuss as we went through this is, if you guys want to keep going, there were other books we could discuss, keep on going with the medical history, and one of them is this guy, Ether Day. And it's actually the description. It's actually the description of the first use of anesthetics in America and the absolutely horrible, horrible things that happened to people as a result. Like, everybody involved in the invention of surgical anesthesia had a terribly miserable life. And this book kind of does a good job of describing how their egos completely derailed them. But funny enough, the one person who was involved in ether anesthesia who came out well was a rural, you said you were in Alabama?
Yes.
So this guy was in Georgia, but he's a physician named Crawford Long, and he used ether to remove some small tumors and do some minor procedures on people. And he actually did that before any of the people who got famous for ether anesthesia had done that. So he actually had the priority, but since he was a small town country physician, he didn't really press his case, and people didn't know about it till much later.
Crawford Long.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm a lawyer, but I know Emory has a museum, and I think some of his original implements are there at the Crawford Long museum or whatever it is at Emory, because they have a lot of hospitals named after him.
Oh wow! I'm gonna add that to my list of medical history kind of go-to places. Yeah, most of them are in Italy or England, so I'm glad to add something stateside, especially with the current situation. Yeah.
Well, there's a I have not been there, but have heard creepy museum of surgery in Chicago that you might want to look into.
Oh,
I have been there.
Oh, do tell.
The Museum of Surgical Science in Chicago, and I was actually going to email you, Dr. Ward, because I went with my friend who wasn't no medical experience, and I was able to expand because of your lectures. I was expanding on some of the stories and information because I remembered your lectures and could tell more stories about it.
Oh, fantastic! You can't see it over the screen, but there's a single tear just kind of strolling right down the cheek there.
I thought about emailing you, but I'm like, he probably, I don't know.
I'm always happy to hear it. That's awesome. So, what was it called again? The Medical Surgical History Museum, or the
Museum of Surgical Science?
Nice. I prefer creepy medical surgery museum, but I'll take it. Yeah.
I've only heard creepy from non-doctors, so just saying.
There's one in Frederick, Maryland. Have you been to that, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine?
No, although I think there's also there's a surgical museum for the military as well, somewhere in the DC area that I haven't been to.
Oh,
yeah. If you guys don't mind sending me a link to that, I'd love to have that on my list.
Done.
I finally made it to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which is a museum of medical history and oddities and just amazingness. So I finally got there this last summer before COVID shut everything down. So that was my final hurrah travel-wise until this pandemic is over. Let's see. Someone once told me in Minneapolis there's a museum of medical. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Do you guys have a note from Zoom on your screen right now, or is it just me? I have a note on my screen saying that a gift from Zoom has been given, and we removed the 40-minute time limit on our group meeting, but they didn't tell me that when I was setting it up. So I'm glad they did that, but I also wish they'd told me that earlier, so I didn't have to set up as many sessions. Well, we'll just keep on rolling then. So yeah, there's apparently in Minneapolis, a museum of medical equipment, and they've got everything in working order, including the x-rays that used to stick your feet on in shoe stores to see your bones and probably irradiate the insanity out of your lower body in the process.
Some of that kind of stuff at the Museum of Surgical Science.
Cool.
Kind of like old equipment type thing.
I have family in Chicago, so next time I'm there, I've got a good base to check it out from. Cool. Now, jumping back, did anybody have any thoughts about the changes regarding the societal basis of the book and how the Victorian society and just the state of hygiene and other things like that played into the situation? It's always kind of fascinating for me to think that that's really not that long ago, and we're talking about really not more than less than 2 centuries ago, and yet things seem to have improved immeasurably. At least in the first world countries. You look at England now versus England then, it's just impossible to not see the difference. Anyone going once? Twice?
Well, I didn't read the book, but I remember one of the stories you told was about hand washing.
Oh, yeah.
And that wasn't even that long ago either. Just like the doctors doing autopsies and then going and delivering babies, and the maternal ward had a higher death rate than I believe it was the nuns that were delivering babies, and had a significantly lower death rate. And the guy wasn't really a strong enough character to really promote hand washing. I believe it was that guy.
Man, I think the owners of the store are going to think I've set you guys up, because that's another book I had as a possibility for our next go, is this one. Let me move in a little bit there. The Doctor's Plague. It's by Sherwin Newland. He was a medical historian and surgeon at Yale for many years. I think he's passed away. But yeah, he's talking about Ignaz Semmelweis, the guy who figured out that you should wash your hands to keep things clean. And yeah, like you said, he basically noted that in the same hospital, you had a ward staffed by midwives with a 3% mortality after women gave birth, and then the ward with the physicians that had like a 25% mortality. And they invoked miasma theory again. This, oh, the doctor's ward is closer to the marshes. It's getting this bad air. That's what's causing these diseases. And, you know, women were getting massive infections. And it was essentially because the doctors were, I mean, you couldn't come up with a better method for causing infection than what they had. The physicians would autopsy people who had died of infectious disease. This is before gloves. This is before hand washing. And then they would go bed to bed doing pelvic examinations on the pregnant women who were in this ward. And the fact that it was a 25% mortality strikes me as frighteningly good, given that situation where you had just room for infection and people didn't know any better. And like you said, Emily, the guy who saw this and had the insight that they should wash their hands fixed the problem, but he was such a poor communicator that he wasn't able to push his agenda, and the medical status quo just reasserted itself, and people went back to doing things the way they did, and many more people died because he just wasn't able to convey his message in a way people were willing to listen to. So it's it's just another fascinating story of medical history gone bad, and really fascinating character study too, and why this guy was, you know, very insightful, but just didn't have what it took to really get people to listen to what he had to say. And just not that it should matter, but it's also thin. Look how thin it is.
One question: why was the like hygiene as like an old Greek goddess, like a Roman, you know, whatever? How did that come about? Like, how is that icon sort of chosen as hygiene?
Oh, well, funny you should say that. I'm reading a book on Greek mythology right now. And so Asclepius, who is possibly a real person who got deified as a healer after his life, or maybe just was mythological all the time, or a combination of people in ancient history who were physicians. Asclepius, the member of the Greek pantheon, was considered to have several daughters and sons, and they all had something to do with healing in some way. And so two of his daughters, the ones I remember offhand, were Panacea, which she was in charge of curing all ills. And then there was Hygeia, and Hygeia was the goddess of basically preventative medicine, good hygiene, keeping things clean. And so even though the Greeks at that time didn't have any insight into the actual causes of disease or how the pathology would affect organs, they knew that cleanliness went some distance to keeping illness at bay. And in fact, the temples of Asclepius were usually on high rocky mountaintops with nice clean air kind of coming through regularly. They had good clean water. And so people would go there to be healed, and whether or not the treatments did anything, the situation that they found themselves in certainly helped. And actually I'll throw this up, pop quiz. What's the symbol of Asclepius? Anybody want to take a stab at that one? DOs and DO students, you got no excuse for getting this one wrong. It's on the side of our building.
Wasn't this the snakes and the
Oh, keep going.
Yeah,
well,
it's the staff with the snake.
So the stick with with two snakes going around it, that's the caduceus of Hermes. Hermes. That's actually more associated with him. And then the staff with a single snake on it is the staff of Asclepius. And so that's actually a symbol of healing. And the Asclepian temples, hey, and Elspeth's got a kitty too, yay. But the the temples of Asclepius actually were renowned for having lots of non-poisonous snakes, or non-venomous snakes on the premises. And while people might not think snake equals healing, there was the symbolic method for associating snakes with healing as well as, perfect, thank you, Elspeth. So that you can see that right there, the staff of Asclepius, single snake, not two.
Well, we went to Rome a few years ago and took a tour of the Forum. And when we were there, our guide pointed out where the sewer god was, the Roman sewer god. And I don't remember the name, of course, but it really has stuck with us that they thought cleanliness was so important that they had like a sewer god. And it was a building, and the aqueduct somehow connected with it and stuff. It was very elaborate.
Yeah, the Romans actually used more water per capita than we do.
Yeah, and so they were all about it, but I mean, I don't know, I thought it was interesting and very progressive, but I was like, wow, and apparently the sewer goddess, I think it was a goddess, was very important in Roman times, so.
Awesome. When I was at Rome a few years ago with my wife, we went to the Vatican, and there were some statues in there of Hermes. I got a good shot of him with the caduceus. But I did not see the sewer god or goddess. And that's going on my list.
It's a building in the Forum.
Ooh, cool.
I guess that was the public works building.
Yeah, I think there's a frightening number of gods, demigods, and goddesses associated with every aspect of life back in ancient Greek and Roman times. It's kind of.
Oh yeah, you could like pick your god. It was very interesting.
On the ones they don't even mention are the household gods, but that's not medical history. We'll give that one up.
Yes.
But we were talking about the snakes. The snakes were actually there. They kept down the vermin, so people didn't have rats and mice to contend with. And there was also the symbolic aspect of snakes shedding their skin and coming out looking all shiny and good after that. It was kind of seen as a metaphor for people going into the temple, shedding their illness and going home. So that was kind of cool as well. Let's see. So yeah, the London sewer system, I think by the time we got to the end of our story, maybe was at a level equivalent to the Roman sewer system by the time they were done. But I think the Romans brought water into the city from far away, and it seems like in London, when we were dealing with the ghost map, one of the major problems was they were pulling water out of the Thames, and the Thames would have intake pipes that were downstream of sewage pipes. So I think, Amy, would you say that's a civil engineering no-no at this point?
That would be a big, big no-no. And they learned their lesson too. They figured it out eventually.
So anybody, any Sweeney Todd fans in the house? Got a couple nods.
I was in the musical.
There we go. So complete this sentence. Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of
Fleet Street.
Fleet Street. Anybody know the significance of Fleet Street? So Fleet Street was built over an actual creek or a stream called the Fleet Stream or the Fleet River, and it was an open river, and it was the river in which all the sewage of London at that time got flushed into and then out of the Thames. So you would walk in a very Fleet way on Fleet Street. It was the cheapest real estate in London because it had an ungodly smell all the time because it was basically an open sewer. And by the time we got to the ghost map in Victorian London, it was still there, but it had been covered over. And I like one thing they mentioned in the book was that actually London has several rivers running through it besides the Thames, but they've been covered over. They're underground rivers, but they're still there, which seems, as a non-engineer, that just blows my mind. Like, what, you mean there's rivers underground? Just kind of fascinating. Oh, you can probably hear my cats now. Here we go. I promised cats, so there we go. All right. So, any other observations on? Let me flip through. Oh, anybody who started to read? Did you get through the first chapter? They're discussing the huge, just the hierarchy of people who are recycling all the waste in London. Even if you can't read the whole book, read the first chapter. It's just fascinating because it's it's recycling to a degree which we can only dream of, yet it's people living in filth in order to actually recycle every bit of scrap, every bit of fabric, the pure men. Anybody want to fill us in on who the pure men were? Amy's shaking her head no. That means she doesn't want to, but she knows the answer. Anybody? Hannah's smiling. I think Hannah knows. Go.
Yeah.
They were the guys who were picking up the dog feces.
Mm-hmm.
Yum.
So they used dog feces and tanning leather, and so they would gather all the dog poop from the streets of London, transport it to the leather tanners, and just imagine being on the same block as the tanners, who would then use it to kind of tan and work the leather. Just again, no consideration for different areas of town. Just you could wind up next door to a tannery or any other industrial complex and have to deal with it.
That's why we have zoning now.
Yes, just on a historic note, General Grant family was involved in tanning, and he said he would do anything besides work in the tanning industry.
Oh, I believe it. Because I'm assuming after dog feces, they found equally nasty and more potent things to put into the process.
Gross.
So let me. There was another little thing I thought was a nice little medical history take on it. Was so John Snow was looking at the nasty water and theorized that the Broad Street water was the causative agent for the cholera epidemic. He took a sample of it and was actually looking at it under a microscope, basically doing a pretty solid job of investigating it. But because it was a bacterium, he didn't see it, even though he was looking. So medical students and prior medical students of mine, you're back on the spot. So he took, where'd it go? He took that sample to another scientist, a guy named Dr. Arthur Hassall, and he saw little bacteria swimming around in it, but he didn't think they were actually the causative event. And meanwhile, in Florence, in Italy, about the same time, coincidentally, a guy named Filippo Pacini discovered the cholera bug, but didn't really have any way to disseminate its importance. So prior med students, when I say Hassall and Pacini, why should that be a little bit of a trigger in your mind for something cool? I will wait. Elspeth's got the 1,000-yard stare. She's remembering all the pop quizzes that she had to deal with back then. Karthik and Teham are rethinking their decision to be here tonight.
I remember Hassall. It's the corpuscles, right?
Yeah.
Node, was it?
No, yeah. You got it.
Okay, yeah.
So Hassall's corpuscles and a Pacinian corpuscle.
Oh yeah.
They're both sensory receptors in the skin. So it's like this weird thing where we have two guys responsible for naming sensory receptors in our skin. We're involved in a very peripheral way to this cholera kind of science as well.
Yeah, that never comes up in clinical medicine, I have to tell you.
Well, I will make it my business to create a disease that attacks the Pacinian corpuscles now, just to get at that. Yeah, so just FYI, so Hannah, so going into neuroscience, Pacinian corpuscles, they are sensory receptors that detect vibration. So they're deep in the kind of subdermal area. They're kind of an onion-shaped thing that deforms in response to deep pressure and vibration. Whereas Hassall's corpuscles are fine sensory receptors that are kind of located in areas like the fingertips, kind of cheek and face like that are very fine sensory areas. So you will hear those terms again, even if it's not immediate. Hey. So yeah, I thought that was just a fun little quickie medical history tidbit that went by. So I guess on page 63, they actually brought up how the anesthesia at Boston General took place. And prior to anesthesia and John Snow getting to work on that, how do you guys think surgery took place? Because surgery had been taking place for millennia. Oh, there's my dog.
Was it just a lot of alcohol?
Actually, alcohol was used. They used ice. Morphine was another thing that would be used sometimes to dull the pain. But what do you think the surgeons had to do?
Be quick.
Yeah. So the hallmark of a good surgeon was how fast they operated, because this is pre-anesthesia, pre-germ theory. So they basically had to get in and do the job as quick as they can. So once again, there's Ether Day, but it comes up peripherally in this book on page 85 is when they bring it up. But yeah, surgery was all about speed. And when germ theory and anesthesia actually came in, it was slow to be adopted by a lot of surgeons because it made them slow down. It made them be meticulous, whereas it was more of a Wild West cowboy style surgery prior to that. So it was a real shift in the way people took that. And actually, one more book I brought up just in case. The Knife Man. This is a theory of one of the greats of surgery in the pre-anesthetic era, a guy named John Hunter. And John Hunter is my hero, but also a horrible villain because he was so brilliant and he used anatomy in such a massively influential way to progress surgery. And he was utterly amoral and did so many terrible things by our contemporary standards. So I'm really torn because I admire him so much and I'm so horrified by some of the things that he did. So
Do you like Halloween?
I love Halloween. I'll let my students answer that. We do Halloween big at our school.
Just thinking you might like it.
Oh yeah.
Ask him for pictures at some point. The costumes are amazing and they do group themes. It's
Oh,
The Anatomy Crew always does a group costume. We were the Harry Potter faculty again this last year.
wow. Okay.
I think my favorite recent one though, we were all cereal box mascots a few years back. That was fun. I got to be Count Chocula, a dream I didn't even know I had until I got to do it. So back to the quick surgery. One of my favorite little surgical anecdote is there was a guy named Robert Liston, and Robert Liston he was one of those speedy, rambunctious surgeon, but he was also a really keen investigator. And if he'd come along in another 20, 30 years, he would have been right on board with the anesthetic and germ theory application to surgery. But he was just a few decades too soon. But he really did try to investigate different ways to dull surgery. And he actually came up with he was there, end of his career was when ether started coming in, and he was really fascinated by it. But he actually used mesmerism to try to hypnotize patients into senselessness to do surgery. And he said it actually worked, but it took hours of prep work to put a person into a state where they were unable to feel the pain just due to pure kind of hypnotic suggestion is why we'd put it now. But I told you all that so I could tell you this. Robert Liston is also the only person who had a surgery with a 300% mortality rate. So your eyeballs are telling me I should continue with this story. Okay, so Robert Liston was a very speedy surgeon, but in addition to speed in the pre-anesthetic era, surgeons also needed several burly orderlies to hold the patient down while the surgery is going on. Because even if you're choosing to go in for surgery, when someone starts slicing into your leg to amputate it or some such thing, you're gonna fight whether you know it's in your best interest or not. So they would have orderlies and other people holding patients down. So during one surgery where he was removing a man's leg at the thigh, doing an amputation, he took his big knife, wrapped it around the guy's leg, made the initial cut, but one of his orderlies had his fingers in the field. And so he removed the leg, and he was renowned for having the speed to do a amputation in about 90 seconds. But he also took off 2 of the fingers of his helper. And when the helper jumped back and screamed, Liston pulled away and his knife went into the crowd. Didn't actually cut anyone, but it came close to an elderly man in the front row who had a heart attack. The patient and the orderly later died of sepsis from an infection caused by the surgery. So one procedure with a 300% mortality rate associated with it. And again, this is all less than 2 centuries ago. Good times.
today, that would have been such an HR nightmare.
What's that?
It would have been such an HR nightmare. Like, come work for us. Wait.
Come hold down people's legs. It'll be fun. So actually,
his rate got better.
Yeah,
Big
but
QI project, right? Like, don't cut your assistants. Oh,
yeah, you got nowhere to go but up from 300%. So if you ever have a chance to see old hospitals, like really old hospitals in the eastern seaboard of the US or even in Europe and other places, oftentimes if they're still intact, there'll be a tower. And the towers used to be where they would actually perform the surgeries because it was far away from other people. They wouldn't have to hear the screams and the yells of people undergoing surgical procedures pre-anesthesia. So yeah, that was, if you see towers on an old, I think Ohio State actually has one. And I asked them if that used to be where they did the surgeries, and they said yes. So there we go. Oh, there we go.
did they make the patients walk up? Or how did they get them down?
Probably depends on their injuries. I mean, they had some type of elevator at the time. Plus, you had big burly orderlies who could probably just carry them up the stairs and then hold them down. But yeah, it was probably very manual labor intensive. All right, let's see. So I'm just trying to see if there's any other stuff in the later on in the book that we haven't discussed yet. Anybody see any other bits that they wanted to bring up or anything else that was kind of interesting? So towards the end of the book, they discuss how the map that John Snow produced was actually a real work of art in terms of science and medical communication, because the map not only showed where the location of the disease was, they actually don't have a good copy of it in the book, which is kind of a shame. But if you Google the Ghost Map or John Snow map, you'll see that they have kind of dark blocks at each building showing the fatalities that occurred in that building, and you can see the cluster around the pump. Okay, it is in there. What? That's the first. Is that the first chapter?
No, it's on the conclusion. It would be 180, 190. It's right next to conclusion, the ghost map.
There we go. Thank you. All right. So if you have it, great. If not, here's a quick view. But all those dark blocks, those are showing the number of people who had died at each location. But one thing that they brought up that I'd never heard of before, so it's kind of interesting to me, is I've seen this map before, but they said in addition to tabulating that, to make sure that his case was as ironclad as possible, he actually walked those streets and figured out not only which places were geographically closest to the pump in terms of absolute space from a bird's eye view, but he actually walked the streets to figure out which streets actually led there quicker. So even if things didn't appear closer, there were routes that made the broad pump more convenient to some buildings that would otherwise have been bird's eye view closer to other pumps. And so apparently he's got kind of a squiggly line in the actual map that he produced showing the radius around which it was more convenient to go to the Broad Street pump. And that line carried, it included all the houses that had massive outbreaks, with a couple exceptions that people would go to the Broad Street pump because it was shown to have more tasty water than other pumps did. There were actually some pumps nearby that were not the source of a cholera outbreak, but were more polluted visually and people wouldn't want to go to and drink from because it was cloudy, nasty water. Whereas the Broad Street pump, which actually had cholera in it at some point, was, looked pure and crisp and good. So that was a little piece of kind of the map I hadn't appreciated before, was how he'd actually done that work of figuring out what things were actually closest. And talking about cholera water made me thirsty. So quick quiz time. So before modern sewage, before modern water treatment, how is it that people in Europe and Asia weren't dying of these massive diarrheal diseases all the time or other related diseases? How did people actually de facto wind up not taking in all these nasty pathogens? Throw out some brainstorms. The more hilariously wrong, the better. This is a good time for that.
I thought it had a lot to do with the population density.
That too, absolutely. But even then, there was another factor involved that, in a way, purified the water that people were drinking in both Europe and Asia, although they were different.
I think copper, like copper pots, right? Or
I think copper does have some antimicrobial properties, but it was never used in a wide enough venue to be effective that way. So good guess, but that's not what we were going for.
Did they
the
boil
water?
their water?
What's that?
Did they boil their water?
Ah, so that's what happened in Asia. What happens in Asia? Why do people boil water? To make
tea and rice.
tea.
Rice, yeah. Tea.
So, yeah, tea actually.
Oh, that's right. They drink the tea.
Yeah, so in Asia, one of the things that prevented massive outbreaks of these diseases is that people would not tend to drink straight up water. They would tend to have tea, which, in addition to having the dried leaves in it, would have some health-giving properties. It's theorized. You boil the water. That kills a lot of stuff. Europeans had a different method. Anybody want to take a stab at what that was?
Alcohol?
Yes, there you go. So people didn't drink water. They drank ale, they drank beer, they drank wine. And I guess the cumulative hangover they were experiencing all the time was better than dying. So some part of me thinks that it had to be watered down. The Greeks always said that they watered their wine down. So maybe that was what kept them from just having monstrous headaches all the time. But yeah, those are two ways that people, I don't think deliberately try to purify the water, but it just worked out that way, as they knew that if they drank water as tea, or they drank, the alcohol fermentation process killed a lot of the microbes that, kept them healthy.
Yeah, it would have had to be dilute in some way. Otherwise, you would have been wandering around dehydrated.
Oh, yeah.
And that would have been non-sustainable.
Yeah. Beyond
the hangovers.
Yeah, I think one rough night would be too much for me. An entire rough lifetime would be no good.
Times were hard.
I remember reading something too interesting. It was like in the book too. It said they were willing to die of cirrhosis at 40, but not of cholera at the age of 20, and so they would just keep drinking.
Well, plus there was no reason they had to suspect that alcohol and cirrhosis were causative. They had no reason to think that was, they were still operating under the humoral theory of disease. Like, oh wow, this guy's liver is all terrible looking. Well, too much black bile. What are you going to do? All right. So yeah, the humoral theory of disease, they didn't even really touch on in here, but it was still operating fairly strongly at that era of time. It didn't really start dying out until the late 1800s. And even then it held on for a while, where people thought that all disease was not caused by any specific agent or even affecting any single organ, but it was a body-wide lack of balance between blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And depending on who you ask, maybe a few other things too.
What was the average life expectancy? Were we looking?
Whenever you're looking at average life expectancy back then, it's always kind of you have to take it with a grain of salt, because a lot of times they factor in infant mortality. And so when you see in the Middle Ages that people only lived into their 30s, that's true if you factor in all the infants and young children who died. But once people got into their 20s, if they were still alive, they tended, barring other horrible things happening to them, they tended to actually live into their 40s and 50s. So I think average life expectancy versus life expectancy of someone who lives past the age of 5 years would be pretty radically different. But yeah, you look at the occupational stuff, the lack of medicine, and the fact that if you don't die due to infectious disease, it's because you're drinking a massive amount of ale and wine all the time. I love ale and wine, by the way. I'll own up, but I'm glad I have other methods to stave off infectious disease. Yeah, so the humoral theory wasn't really anything that they talked about here at all, which was another massively problematic thing, because when they were talking about miasma theory of disease, those of you got a little past the halfway point, when they were bringing it up with the medical authorities at the time, they were constantly hitting their head against the fact that miasma theory was so entrenched that whenever people came up with contradictory data, they would always try to find some post hoc reason why, oh, well, it's because of this, and the bad water triggered their susceptibility to the miasma, and that's what caused disease. They were always looking for ways to preserve the prior theory. And humoral theory was that on steroids, where people did everything they could to preserve the humoral theory of disease, despite the fact it really doesn't have any basis in reality. But we had 2,000 years of it because it was an explanatory method people liked, and it gave them a framework to operate in, even though it didn't have any what we consider to be data supporting it. Sorry, soapbox. I'll step off now. Real controversial. I'm taking down the humoral theory of disease. Hope nobody's offended. All right.
Yeah, but isn't that what a lot of people did though back in, well, I mean, really anytime less than 100 years ago, because you needed something to explain. And so that was religion for a lot of people. And just like when you tell somebody that the earth isn't the center of the solar system, people are going to be like, oh, maybe you're wrong, but it's a fact, right? So.
Well, the heliocentric thing is really amazing too, in that, the earth going around the sun is completely counterintuitive to your everyday experience. It really doesn't. I mean, it takes a lot to actually accept that. And then the data that you have to get involves a lot of heavy duty mathematics and modeling. And once you get the data and you can appreciate it, you can get it. But I get why people didn't like the heliocentric theory, because it doesn't jive with our everyday existence. Like, well, come on, if the Earth's spinning, I should be flying off into space. What are you talking about? But yeah, so humoral theory, I mean, the main problem with it is that people could always find, it was so loose, people could always find a way to excuse poor results by invoking humoral theory to address the deficiencies of humoral theory. Like, oh, that treatment didn't work. Well, that guy just had too much, he had too much phlegm that counteracted the treatment that was trying to get rid of the excessive amount of blood that he had. There's always a way for them to do that. I think before we run out of steam, there was one passage in here that I thought, oh, here we go. On page 85, this one just kind of horrified me a little bit, considering what we're all living through right now. So in 85, imagine the terror and panic if a biological attack killed 4,000 otherwise healthy New Yorkers over a 20-day period. It's like, crap. Okay. I did choose this book as kind of a topical thing in that it involves pandemics, and we're in the midst of coronavirus, but I was thinking like that was prescient, because we got more than 4,000 dead, and it wasn't a biological attack per se, but it's definitely we are living through a continuation of this same process where hygiene, public health is butting up not only against entrenched ideas about how disease spreads, but also political and social barriers to addressing it, and how far is too far in terms of prevention, how far is too little, and is there even a tightrope to walk, or is it constantly varying depending on the area you're at? So there we go. Now I am getting topical. So there we go. So yeah, I thought that was kind of, oh yeah, please.
I just wanted to, I think what has shocked me is how, I don't know, we're taught like science, like everything we're taught is founded on basic science. Like a lot of experiments have been done, and that the information that was learned from that is what's taught to us as students, regardless of your field, whether you're an attorney or an engineer or a medical student. But I think I am just floored by how social issues and politics can influence how you respond to things that should be handled by science. So that's a first. I did not think it would be as heavy as it is, and we're definitely not going to talk about politics. I know that's not something we should talk about, but just you said that it was fascinating how much of a role politics has to play in medical science in this day and age.
And whether it's good or bad, you can see that that's nothing new. I mean, this book, they definitely bring up how not just politics, but authority and medical authority, political authority can have a massive impact on this stuff. And I think to their credit in London, they did get the push to improve things at that time, even if they didn't jump on board with Jon Snow's theories. I think, the current pandemic has really shown me that a lot of people don't get how science operates, because they think that when scientists change their opinion based on new data, that somehow makes science faulty. It's like, no, that's what science is. It's continually reassessing. You're not going for certainty in the moment. You're going for a process that continually improves. But it's clear that a lot of people don't really, they see that changing the recommendations is somehow a failure, when it's really, that's what the process is. And it's aggravating, I'd prefer to have cut and dried correct answers right off the bat too, but we don't get that luxury. Yeah, so I think hopefully the issues we're dealing with now that we're smaller scale, like we don't have to come up with the fact that water can spread disease at this point. We're aware of what viruses and bacteria are, and we can make our interventions based on that knowledge. And even though we're finding out new stuff, I'd like to think we're dealing with smaller scale issues in a way because we have a better sense of what the boundaries are for the infectious diseases. That's my optimistic yay progress side. My cynical side is, well, this book reinforces the idea that people have always been kind of dumb and will do things that don't make sense all the time anyway. And we have to deal with them as kindly and effectively as we can anyhow.
Resistance to new knowledge. It's terrifying.
Well, I think the thing that gets me is the idea that new knowledge is somehow makes all the prior knowledge suspect. Like, no, the fact that we've rethought something doesn't mean that the old stuff was bad. It was the best we had at the time. Like, just because we have better planes now doesn't mean that the biplanes that people were using in the early 1900s were terrible. Just that's what they.
My recent aggravation is people who don't understand that science takes time, and they're like, well, you guys are all smart. Why can't you get it done faster? Like, you clearly aren't working hard enough. And you're like, that's not how this works.
I refer to that as the CSI effect. We need this DNA sample run now. Okay, here it is. No.
I talked to the mass spec and it worked faster.
Yeah, so pop culture it's a double-edged sword in that people see how cool science is, yet they only ever see the results rather than the process, and the process can be painstaking and slow. Cool. So I'm pretty much at the end of my little soapbox. Did anybody have any parting thoughts? And if you guys are interested, we could also kind of talk other books to follow up on and timelines. And if anyone has had their fun but isn't interested in going on, I will not be offended if you want to call it a day.
Well, I want to thank you for reaching out to us. This was very interesting. I know David and I, with our mute button on, have been saying, oh, of course we didn't know that. It's like a little medical school lecture. Very interesting.
Well, these guys can tell you I hate talking. So, you have to really work hard to get me to come out of my shell.
Yeah, clearly it's an issue, but maybe you will do it again.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts?
Well, and when the pandemic gets not to be a pandemic, maybe there's a vaccine. If you'd like to do something at the store, of course, we would welcome it. Just let us know.
I was actually thinking if this went well, and it seems like it's going pretty well, we could even do a joint thing where we have a virtual session for people who are away and an in-person session at the store for anyone who wants to hop on by. Mostly because your store is awesome and I like hanging out there.
Well, and we have a lot of space,
Mm-hmm.
so people can social distance and everything else. So, and we have high ceilings and good ventilation, and we can open our windows. So,
cool. Just out of curiosity, of the people who are on here right now, who's in the Lewisburg area-ish at the moment? Like not in the area, yeah. So we got just a few. So yeah, I think given the pandemic, I'd actually be happy to do it either both ways, or maybe have a joint session where we're in the bookstore, but maybe have people able to Zoom in if they want to come from a distance as well. So.
Oh, absolutely. We could set up a Zoom at the bookstore. That would be no problem at all.
This went better than I expected. I was expecting massive computer glitches to derail at least the first 20 minutes of this. So I'm very happy we didn't wind up with that happening.
I don't know if you have an institutional access to like an institutional Zoom, but those are the ones that let you kind of do indefinite meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if WVSM has that kind of a thing.
WVSM uses a different program. It's WebEx, and
oh yeah,
so I looked at actually I was thinking about getting a month subscription to the more advanced Zoom. The problem is it's one of those rolling recurrence things, and I did the math in my head like, no, I'd rather schedule 3 separate meetings than have to remember to go kill this $15 a month subscription, which will automatically recur until my credit card gets canceled. So,
Well, yeah, the company I work for will not let us use Zoom because they have security issues, which I don't think matters for something like this.
yeah,
But
I can do
WebEx is really not stable because I have to use WebEx with some companies I deal with, and I have learned to detest WebEx. Microsoft Teams meeting is pretty stable, but it doesn't have a lot of the functionality that Zoom does. So I think Zoom is probably the better way to go here.
Yeah, I think Zoom's pretty ubiquitous. People are good with it. And one benefit of Zoom is I can do this and put myself in Dr. Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum at a moment's notice. So that's fun for me.
I would be happy to keep doing these if you want to like choose a new book every now and then. And I think that would be really, really cool and keep me in touch. And I love, I'm in a quarantine book club right now where we read more fiction stuff, but it's really fun. So I like it.
Yeah, so I'm happy to be the point person, but I want to make sure you guys feel like you've got a chance to jump in with any suggestions. So I threw some suggestions out there earlier. The one book I didn't get a chance to actually physically grab is another one I wanted to throw out there. Let me share my screen. So my apologies, bookstore owners, but I'm going to jump to the Amazon page, but we'd still make everybody buy from you. But this is another book that came out relatively recently about how antisepsis made its way into surgery. And Lindsay Fitzharris, she's hilarious just on her own, but this is her first book, and it's about a guy named Joseph Lister, who basically figured out, based on the germ theory and methods of treatment that Louis Pasteur was using in France, how to apply antiseptic procedures to surgery, and how he had a lot of trouble getting people to buy into that, despite the obvious benefits that it had whenever he would show people the data. So that's another cool book. And just to
we have that book right now. I know at the store because I saw it today.
Sweet.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think this is great. It really helps us. Of course, this has been a rough period of time for our store, so this is great. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome.
Yeah, Dr. Ward, I remember you gave us a lecture back when I was a student. When was that? 2013? I think it was the second year, maybe. So anyway, you did a lecture on like surgical history, and it was thoroughly entertaining. So I don't know if you've reprised that in the recent history, but
we've expanded to a 6-lecture series at this point.
Woo!
Yeah,
magical. So anyway, I just
people get a certificate at the end too.
So cool.
I was curious because you're a gastroenterologist, right? Or you're going to be in like a couple weeks or something.
I'm a geriatrician, so I don't. So gastroenterologists look at
geriatrics. Okay.
Older patients, the complicated puzzles that people become.
But there's some.
That's funny because I'm going to go into pediatrics, so the exact opposite of that.
Maybe a little more similar than not.
Yes, my fiance is a pediatric oncologist.
Oh, wow.
So we both deal with heavy things, and we more alike than you'd imagine. We talk a lot about poop.
You know, for those of you that might be interested, I have a background in medical malpractice defense and managing anesthesia practices. So
wow,
just reach out.
Was that all born from the ether experience with the tonsillectomy, or was that?
No,
probably so. Yeah.
No.
Cool. So so the butchering art would be a possibility, and then like I said, the knife man, pre-anesthetic surgery, ether day, how actual surgical anesthesia came to be, the one about hand washing and hygiene that way, the Doctor's Plague by Sherwin Newland. And this is one it's a little bit thicker, but it's a fairly famous book about more contemporary stuff, how human body donors are used in medical education, but also medical research. So those are just a few that I had as possibilities, but
I love that book.
Steph,
Yeah, I've read like all of her stuff except for the one about ghosts, I think.
yeah, the one of the anatomy societies I belong to keeps on toying around the idea of trying to get her to be a keynote speaker at one of our meetings.
Nice.
Cool. But does anybody have any thoughts on where they'd like to go with this, or not? Oh, actually, and I think Hannah, we mentioned neuroscience. I grabbed, but then forgot to bring with me The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. That's a fantastic piece of pop science writing. All the chapters are short but fascinating. You read the book basically by convincing yourself that you will only read one more chapter, because they're like 3 or 4 pages long, and then it's 3 a.m. and you don't know what happened.
Oh, okay.
I might have a copy somewhere in here. So, any thoughts?
Read some, I mean, these aren't really history of medicine books, but I've read some decent medicine books. One that kind of really inspired me was The Deepest Well, about childhood adversity and future disease. I thought that was interesting. I love that book. I recommend it to everyone. I got one of my preceptors to read it. I have on my shelf The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and I still haven't read it. So I know that's kind of down this alley too. So
It's really good. I've read that. It's really good.
I haven't read it, but for anyone who's not familiar, it's basically about a cell line called the HeLac cell line is used in a lot of medical research, and it's all derived from Henrietta Lacks, a cancer patient, and this cell line was basically cultured from her without her knowledge or permission, and it's kind of an exploration of the medical, legal, ethical considerations of that you've got this, this kind of very ubiquitous scientific tool that people use, but the way in which it was gathered prior to people getting very aware of consent procedures was, not really delved into. So it's kind of an interesting take on how all those things have come together. I haven't read it either. I'm just familiar with the outline.
Well, and there's a movie, so it makes it, easy if people don't want to read it.
I did not.
Yeah, Oprah's.
I did have a copy behind me. There you go. So, Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Even if you're into neuro at all, it's a great read.
Fun.
somebody's recommended that book to me. I've been meaning to read it. It's on my list.
There's also like The Butterfly and the Diving Bell.
What's that one about?
It's about someone who's like essentially, I think he's like progressively getting locked in.
Yeah.
I think it was like that
And
one.
he writes a novel with
While he's like with his eye motion. Yeah, it's I can't say it's a quick read despite how short the book is. It's just one of those ones, at least for me, like it takes a lot of cognitive thought to dive into that one, as it were, but it's a good one.
Very cool.
Can you repeat the title of that book?
I think it's like I forget exactly. It's like The Butterfly and the Diving Bell.
I think that's it.
Which may or may not also have a movie. The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. Whenever anything actually. It's by Jean-Dominique Bauby. I think he's a French guy, if I'm not wrong.
The name certainly suggests it. There you go.
And I think it was originally written in French and then they translated it.
Cool. All right. So, any thoughts on what direction you guys would like to go, or should I just kind of throw a dart at a dartboard, or anybody want to put a suggestion out there?
I would opt for this to be like a monthly or maybe every other month kind of a deal.
Oh, actually, yeah. While we're on that topic, did you guys feel like you need a little more lead time with the topic to really enjoy it, or was there enough time with the announcement? because I'm happy to do the quick book report, but also I don't want people to feel rushed or feel like they haven't done their homework if they didn't get a chance to finish the book beforehand. I think
I like
is sufficient.
I liked this discussion a lot. I forgot about it until like 2 weeks ago, and then I got my book like 4 days ago, so I didn't have time to read it. So I think if I had remembered, a month would have been enough time.
I guess so. Would 2 months be too long in between sessions, or would a month be enough time between sessions if we choose the book early? I think whatever's convenient for y'all.
I think the thing about this one was by the time I heard about it and ordered the book, and with shipping times being variable, just because the delivery at the time was kind of variable, I think I had like it for 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks I've had to do tons and tons of work. So I feel like if we were able to get the book, it would take me probably about a month to find time to read it, but the acquisition takes about like a month.
Yeah, and this was the first one, so we kind of had to sense out what the parameters were. So,
and shipping has been sketchy at best right now.
Yeah, and that's part and parcel.
Usually it's super quick. We do our bookstores in the store every other month, and that gives people time to acquire the book and read the book and think about it. So that's just a suggestion, but I think this is super interesting, and I'd like to do a blend of the Zoom and the in-store thing. I think that would be really cool.
Absolutely. Oh, and quick show of hands, who found out about this by going to the bookstore in person? Not surprising, nobody right now. Who found out about it on the bookstore's Facebook page? Who heard about it through me? Okay. I'll keep pushing that out there. So Amy and Hannah, how did you guys hear about
Well, I think it was Instagram, but yeah, social media through the bookstore is how I found out.
Same.
Okay. So we'll just kind of keep the social media presence up, and I'll keep pushing it on my Facebook and other pages.
Would we be opposed if I know people interested that I could invite?
Absolutely. And if we ever were so lucky that we had too many people, we could just split the sessions and do a couple sessions on alternate nights. If we were ever that lucky, that'd be great. So yeah, the more the merrier. All right. So what do you guys think about maybe a 5 to 6 week timeline, announcing the book as quickly as possible and just trying to get it out to you as quick as we can? Is that like a reasonable timeline?
Just so you know, our shipping times have come down and things are starting to normalize. So I think that, from a shipping perspective, it wouldn't be as sketchy as it was.
All right. All right. Last thing, anybody want to strongly take a stab at which book we choose, or should I just kind of pick from the ones we've discussed and just throw them in the air, see which one comes up closest to me, something like that? Or...
I'm probably hit or miss, or whether I'll do a book each time, so I'll excuse myself from the vote.
No worries.
But I really enjoyed this book. It, like you said, it intersected a lot of my interests, so and it was timely, so definitely enlightening.
Excellent.
Yeah, likewise, I'm moving and starting a new job and all the rest, so I don't know that I'll have any time in the next 2 months, but if I do, I'd love to join.
Well, we'll make sure you're invited, and even if you don't get to read it, you can always participate in the discussion. Does anybody feel strongly they want to do another book based around pandemic history? Or are we getting enough of that from the news?
I have no strong opinions about anything right now, so.
All right, well, I'll look at all the titles we kicked around, and I'll find something that will be entertaining for all involved. How's that sound? Groovy. All right, hey, thank you all so much for participating. This went so well, and I'm very happy that you all jumped in. And if you have any suggestions on how we could improve it, or what we can do to make it even better for you, feel free to message or email me, and I'll be happy to go as we can. And hopefully next time we can have a blended in-person and virtual do this.
That's great, and thank you very much.
Yay, let's give it up for new chapter. Yay.
Yay.
All right, I'll see you all later. Thank you so much.
All right.
Hey.
You guys, bye.
Bye.